two forces in constant tension. Class conflict pushes for change. The poor want more. The rich want to keep what they have. This generates political pressure. Social norms push for stability. Traditions, expectations, shared beliefs about what's acceptable. These constrain how far conflict can go. Today, we examine both in mathematical detail: the equations that govern inequality, the dynamics that erode or strengthen social constraints, and the critical interaction between them. Start with wealth distribution. Our variable WW represents the ratio of wealth held by the rich versus the poor. When W is high, wealth is concentrated. When W is low, wealth is more evenly distributed. What makes W change? Income flows. In any period, the economy generates new wealth. How that wealth gets divided between classes affects W. If the rich capture a disproportionate share, W increases. If the poor capture more, W decreases. The key insight is that wealth concentration tends to be self-reinforcing. The rich can invest. They earn returns. They use wealth to influence policy. Unless something intervenes, W tends to grow over time. This is the first reinforcing loop in the model. More wealth leads to more ability to capture wealth, which leads to more wealth. Left unchecked, it drives toward maximum concentration. Class conflict, our variable C, depends on wealth distribution but isn't identical to it. C measures the intensity of active struggle between classes: protests, strikes, political mobilization, social tension. C increases when wealth distribution worsens and people notice. Relative deprivation grows. Expectations are disappointed. The system seems illegitimate. C decreases when conditions improve, even if inequality persists. Hope exists for future improvement. The system seems legitimate despite inequality. The relationship between W and C isn't linear. Low inequality doesn't guarantee low conflict. High inequality doesn't guarantee high conflict. Perceived fairness and trajectory matter as much as absolute levels. This is why rapidly growing economies can tolerate high inequality. Everyone's getting richer, so conflict stays low. But when growth stops and inequality persists, conflict spikes. Social norms, our variable N, act as a buffer. N represents the strength of informal social constraints, traditions, expectations, shared beliefs about acceptable behavior. When N is high, even self-interested actors follow rules. When N is low, anything goes. N is a stock that changes slowly. Norms build over generations through socialization, shared experience, repeated interaction. They don't change overnight. What strengthens norms? Consistent enforcement, legitimate institutions, shared prosperity, low conflict, successful collective action. What weakens norms? Visible norm violations by elites, perceived hypocrisy, sustained inequality, high conflict, failed institutions. Notice the feedback. High conflict erodes norms, which enables more extreme behavior, which increases conflict. Another reinforcing loop, but in the negative direction. The critical interaction is between C and N. When norms are strong, conflict is constrained. Even if people are angry, they channel that anger through legitimate means. Protests stay peaceful. Elections remain accepted. Losers concede. When norms are weak, conflict is unconstrained. Anger becomes violence. Elections become coups. Losers rebel. Mathematically, N acts as a damping factor on C. The equation looks something like dc dt and FW, Gn, xc. Conflict grows based on wealth distribution, but decays based on norm strength. Strong norms pull conflict back toward manageable levels. Weak norms let conflict explode. But here's the key. High conflict also erodes norms. So we have dn dt equals h baseline, k c x n. Norms grow from baseline socialization, but erode when conflict is high. This creates the possibility of a vicious cycle. The interaction between C and N can produce tipping dynamics. In normal operation, the system is stable. Conflict rises, norms dampen it, conflict falls. Small perturbations die out. But if conflict exceeds some threshold, it erodes norms faster than they can regenerate. Weakened norms fail to dampen conflict. Conflict rises further. Norms erode more. This is a positive feedback loop that can tip the system into a new regime. Not oscillation around equilibrium, but divergence toward a new state. Either norm, collapse and chaos, or revolutionary transformation. The math involves non-linear interactions. Below the threshold, the balancing loop dominates. Above the threshold, the reinforcing loop dominates. The threshold itself depends on parameters: how quickly norms regenerate, how sensitive they are to conflict, how quickly conflict responds to norms. Different societies have different thresholds. Some can absorb enormous conflict without tipping. Others tip easily. What conditions produce equilibrium in the class conflict and norm system? For stable equilibrium, we need wealth distribution that doesn't generate unsustainable conflict, norms strong enough to dampen conflict that does arise, conflict low enough not to erode norms below critical levels. Mathematically, at equilibrium, dc dt equals 0 and dn dt equals 0. We can solve for the equilibrium values. C depends on W and N. NB depends on C and baseline norm generation. These simultaneous equations determine where the system settles. The equilibrium exists, but is it stable? Do small perturbations grow or decay? Stability analysis shows that the equilibrium is stable when norms are sufficiently strong relative to conflict sensitivity. When norms weaken, the equilibrium becomes unstable. The system can flip to a different regime. What does this tell us about policy? First, wealth distribution matters, but indirectly. Extreme concentration generates conflict. Conflict erodes norms. Norm erosion destabilizes the system. The path from inequality to instability runs through these intermediate variables. Second, norms are the key buffer. Strong norms can tolerate more inequality than weak norms. Investing in norm strength through legitimate institutions, shared prosperity, civic education, buys stability. Third, tipping points are real. The system can handle stress up to a point. Beyond that point, it cascades. Early intervention is far cheaper than late intervention. Fourth, perception matters as much as reality. Conflict depends on perceived injustice, not just actual inequality. Managing narratives, maintaining legitimacy, keeping hope alive, these affect the equations. Fifth, history matters. Norms are slow stocks. They reflect accumulated experience. A society with a history of cooperation has norm capital to draw on. A society with a history of conflict doesn't. Here's your challenge. For the political economy you identified last episode, estimate the conflict and norm variables. How concentrated is wealth? What level of conflict exists? How strong are social norms? Is the system in equilibrium, or is it moving? If moving toward stability, or toward a tipping point, what would it take to strengthen norms, to reduce conflict, to change wealth distribution? Sketch the feedback loops. Which are dominant? Balancing or reinforcing? Next episode, the legislative sector. How does political pressure become policy? What determines the direction and speed of legislation? See you then.